When you go to a NASCAR race, one of the first things that you'll notice is just how many people are there. It's absolutely breathtaking when you see a track, when you walk in and see tens of thousands, sometimes over 100,000 fans just like you, excited to see a race. It is one of the best feelings in all of sports to be at. And today, I want to go over the best attended races for each active NASCAR track that we have. Now, when I say that, what I mean is tracks that were either on the 2022 schedule that are actual tracks or new tracks for 2023. I also will add that these numbers may have been matched since then. We're only going with the first time that they happened, though. So you're not going to see the LA Coliseum, Chicagoland Speedway, Kentucky Speedway, any of those on this list. This is also for Cup as well. So there'll be 26 tracks in all. So let's just get right into it. Starting off, let's look at the Nashville Superspeedway. In 2021, this race had 40,000 spectators at it. And it was the first race back in the Nashville market in decades, so it was a really big deal for NASCAR, who's trying to build long-term in the market for the fairgrounds. The only problem was that this track, who had come back from the dead of 10 years, had not had the proper infrastructure for a crowd that big and was marred by traffic issues. So it wasn't the worst race ever, but a lot of people remember that as a huge problem for it. Ultimately, the racing on track was dominated by Kyle Larson. The North Wilkesboro Speedway's biggest confirmed crowd was 50,000 in 1995. This track is coming back next year, but this was one of the last years of North Wilkesboro's initial run from the start of NASCAR. The track was old school in many ways, especially in the fact that they didn't really raise the seating capacity all that much. When you look at races from there in the 80s and early 90s, it still was around 20 to 30,000 showing up. So this was a big blast from the past, and when you look back in hindsight, you can actually understand NASCAR's thinking in going away from this low-capacity crowd that was low for their standards. This race saw Dale Earnhardt beat Jeff Gordon by 13.5 seconds. Now, the Circuit of the Americas, or COTA, saw about 60,000 based on estimates in 2021. This is probably the most modern facility in NASCAR when it comes to the most recently built, as it was an F1 track built at the start of the last decade. This race saw a deluge of rain, and to be honest, in person, it really sucked being wet the entire time, because between the heat and the rain back and forth, you just always were uncomfortable. This race was ended prematurely, seeing Chase Elliott as the winner. The newest track on the list here is the Worldwide Technology Raceway, or Gateway, that earlier this year saw an estimated 80,000. There was a huge effort put together by this track in the St. Louis area for a long time to get NASCAR to come here. And when it did, well, it was very memorable. The biggest part of the race everybody remembers was when Ross Chastain pissed off Chase Elliott and Denny Hamlin, and both of them, former rivals, teamed up together to go after the Watermelon Man. This also saw a pretty eventful finish where Joey Logano beat Kyle Busch in a rate-lace duel. Now, the Homestead Miami Speedway saw its biggest crowd of 80,000 during NASCAR's boom period in 2004. The ending of the inaugural chase for the Nextel Cup saw this huge crowd watching a 5-man battle for the championship, where realistically any of them could win given a few things happen here or there. In the late race restart at the end, Greg Biffle ran away with the win, but Kurt Busch was managing to hold on to win the title by only 8 points over Jimmy Johnson, at the time the closest margin of victory in NASCAR history for a championship. Now, the Darlington Raceway has the earliest of the records set, with 80,000 in 1958. While this number's been matched since, this was the #1 race in NASCAR in general in prestige until about the 70s, when the Daytona 500 officially took over. And this is one of the first Southern 500s as well, which saw Fireball Roberts win by 5 laps after former dominant leader Curtis Turner blew an engine late in the running. The Martinsville Speedway's biggest crowd was seen in the spring race of 2004 when 91,000 showed up. This track has been on the schedule from the start of NASCAR to this day, and this race to this day is one of the most memorable. The big one is that you saw concrete come up out of the track into Jeff Gordon's car, and a huge red flag was made from it. This at the time was actually considered a small crowd for NASCAR at the track, and even with the number this race put up, NASCAR was talking about leaving it. Rusty Wallace's final win also was this event. Watkins Glen International's biggest number officially is 100,000 from 2013. This was the first Gen 6 race at the Glen, and to be completely honest, it was a really good one. And this race also was the start of the Glen having 100,000 each race like it does today. This also, in a big way, was redemption for Kyle Busch, who in 2012 had a heartbreaking loss, and in this one would not let it slip away again. For the New Hampshire Motor Speedway, 101,000 in 2003 was the mark to hit. And this was the peak for New Hampshire when it came to attendance, racing, everything. From about 2003 to 2009 or 10, this is the crowd that we saw every race here. And this race did have a good amount of wrecks, which kept it spicy and interesting, and ultimately led to a Jimmy Johnson victory. For the Sonoma Raceway, their biggest crowd was in 2006 with 102,000. This was a fight between the past and the present of Hendrick Motorsports. The past which had left was Terry Labonte, and this was his last gasp for a victory in the 96 Hall of Fame racing Chevrolet. Ultimately, though, he wouldn't be able to do so, but it was still a valiant effort. The president of Hendrick Motorsports at the time, Jeff Gordon, would be the man to beat him out for the victory, and it would also be one of the defining steps in Gordon matching and surpassing Dale Earnhardt in wins. Later in that 2006 season, the Phoenix Raceway saw their biggest attendance ever at 106,000, and this was the race that set the championship fight for Miami. And it saw a fight for the win between Kevin Harvick and Jimmy Johnson, with Harvick prevailing. This race is one that is relatively forgotten in the history of the Phoenix Raceway, as while Harvick did get a very close victory in a late race restart, there really was nothing that defined this race in time. Now in 2004, the Richmond Raceway got their biggest crowd ever for the spring race at 115,000. And this was a race where smoked DW on live TV, and it was pretty savage. And it was also part of Richmond's major sellout streak that spanned about 40 races if I recall right. Dale Jr. would be the one who would get the victory at the end of the night. Next up is Road America, which got 120,000 in 2021 according to estimates. This was the first race for the NASCAR Cup Series in over half a century, and it was really shown with a huge showing from the Wisconsin racing fan base, as they came out in force for both races that weekend, and I will say from being there, it was crowded shoulder to shoulder anywhere you walked. While a lot of the crowd was shadowed over by the trees and the forest around the track, you could tell when you were there that you were at something special. And with this, Chase Elliott would end up getting the victory. That 120,000 mark was also put up by the Auto Club Speedway in 2003. This was the crest of Fontana's original opening wave in NASCAR, where they were growing. Numerous lead changes were had throughout this race, which kept it interesting compared to other early Fontana races. But late in the running, Kurt Busch would run away on a restart, winning late and basically probably pissing off most of the fans, as he was one of the most hated drivers at the time. The Kansas Speedway put up their big mark in 2005 with 125,000 fans at the race. This was part of the second chase for the Nextel Cup, which at the time had a lot of hype, and it was also a year removed from Joe Nemechek and Ricky Rudd's great battle at Kansas in 2004. But the big defining feature of this race is the fact that it is Mark Martin's final victory in the number 6 car for Roush Racing. The Atlanta Motor Speedway matched this 125,000 number in the spring race of 2004. This was the era of fantastic Atlanta finishes. So of course, even though they changed the layout, changed the date, changed all that with Atlanta in the past, it was still a huge draw for fans. But ultimately, this race would be more spread out of the two Atlanta races in 2004, but fans weren't really too upset, as NASCAR's most popular driver, Dale Earnhardt Jr., ran away with the victory. Now, the Pocono Raceway topped 130,000 in 2007. This was the only race at Pocono that actually finished in 2007, as the spring race had rained out. And it actually was a pretty good one, being the last Gen 4 race at this track. While Kurt Busch dominated and basically helped his effort to make the 2007 chase, everyone behind him was shuffling position throughout the race, and strategy was paramount to making this race as interesting as it was. Now, the Dover Motor Speedway's top number was 150,000 in 2005. This one started with Elliott Sadler actually being the dominant car of the day, but as was with most of 2005, he could not keep it up front. Kyle Busch, an incredible rookie at the time, had ran at elite level 2 and showed a lot of people that, hey, that Las Vegas second place finish earlier in the season wasn't a fluke. But nobody at the end could beat Greg Biffle, who outlasted all of the competition and had one of the funniest burnouts in recent NASCAR memory of the last 20 years. Speaking of the Las Vegas Motor Speedway, their biggest attendance was in 2004, with 156,000 fans. It was a week before the aforementioned Atlanta race record, and the big story of this race was the fact that Dale Jr. had a DNF, not for a crash, not for an engine issue, but because he was actually too slow to run on the track. It was, to this day, probably the worst single race performance in Dale Jr.'s career. But up front, Matt Kenseth would look to defend his 2003 win at the track and title with his second straight win of the season in 3 races at Vegas. In 2003, the Michigan International Speedway topped 160,000 people. Sterling Marlin had annihilated the field early, leading 102 of 200 laps, and it seemed like he was going to get the victory. But at the end of the day, it would be won by Kurt Busch. Now, that same season, in the spring, the Bristol Motor Speedway started their large sellout streak of 160,000 as they upped seats that year, and it was the start of the largest capacity era for Bristol as well. Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Spencer were strong in this race, but much like it had happened before and what had happened after, a Busch had won the race, Kurt Busch, and this was part of his Bristol domination of the early 2000s. Entering the top 5 of largest crowds for a track was the Charlotte Motor Speedway's 180,000 for the 2004 Coca-Cola 600. This race was instrumental in implementing the green-white checker, as late in the race there had to be an extensive red flag so that there could be enough track cleanup for the race to finish at its scheduled distance under green. The long stop between racing action is in a big way what prompted NASCAR to implement green-white checker finishes so that every race could end under green if possible. It also was part of Jimmy Johnson's Coke 600 domination, as it was the second straight year of what would turn out to be 3 straight wins in the race. In 2003, we also saw the largest Talladega Super Speedway crowd of 190,000 at the Aaron's 499. This one had a huge crash at the start that took out the majority of the field, but the main action would happen at the end. Firstly, there was the controversy of if Dale Earnhardt Jr. had crossed under the yellow line or if he was forced under there instead of going on his own accord. That was a pass for the win, as this was what would turn out to be Dale Jr.'s 4th straight win at Talladega, a record that is still to this day not been broken. Entering the podium, the bronze goes to the Daytona International Speedway for having 200,000 fans at the 2003 Daytona 500. This was the shortest Daytona 500 in NASCAR history at 109 laps. Many remember it for Ryan Newman having a scary tumble through the tri-oval grass earlier in the day. But what is also remembered from it is Michael Waltrip getting the rain win, as he had an intense battle with Jimmy Johnson, Kurt Busch, Kevin Harvick, and basically anyone of the who's who of NASCAR at the end of that race, with aid from his teammate Dale Jr., who at the time was 2 laps down. The silver medal goes to Texas Motor Speedway in 2004 with 216,000 fans. Yes, Texas Motor Speedway was one of the most attended places in the history of sports. This race actually can be remembered by many as including myself, as Bill Elliott's last shot at glory, as he used an experimental Evernham 91. This also was the last time that Texas had one race weekend before the 2023 season would commence. But the big sticking point and selling point of this race was the great finish between Elliott Sadler and Casey Kane, which saw the M&M's Ford outlast the Dodge dealer's Dodge by just inches. But ultimately, the gold goes to the #1 most attended race for a track and the most attended NASCAR race ever, and one of the most attended sporting events ever, the 1994 Brickyard 400 at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. While this also was the most attended race ever, it was the most attempted race ever as well, as more cars attempted to qualify for this race than had been seen at any other race in NASCAR history. Nearly 100 entries were made for this race, as it was a huge deal. It was the first time that a major stock car series like NASCAR would race on the hallowed grounds of Indianapolis. And with it being the first race at the Brickyard, everyone went all out. Rick Mast would lead the first lap of the race after holding off a hard charge from Dale Earnhardt. Earnhardt would fall back, and so would Mast, as ultimately Jeff Gordon would become the first boy to win the race. Now with that, I'm going to pass this one on to you. What were the biggest races when it comes to attendance that you've ever seen or attended? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're at it, leave a like on this video, share this video, and subscribe to my channel for more great NASCAR content. Thank you so much to all of my channel members, new and old, who have been supporting this channel. And until next time, have a good one.